In October of 1884, after the Hollister Gulch mine collapse killed 41 men, the company gave their widows 2 weeks to vacate. Most packed to leave. Maria O'Connell did not. She gathered 5 other widows from the same blast, pooled their savings, $32, and bought the condemned foreman's boarding house. As winter hit and the company cut off coal to the shacks, the House of Six stayed warm and started a plan that would break the company's grip on the whole town. The Hollister Gulch Mining Company owned everything: the mine, the shacks, the store, even the doctor. When a man died in the tunnels, his family wasn't just mourned, they were evicted. Widows were supposed to vanish, to take their children and beg on the roads. But Maria O'Connell had spent 10 years in that town watching the company bleed families dry. She knew the store overcharged 50%, that rent was deducted from wages before men ever saw a dime, and that the foreman's boarding house, the one they just bought, was a wreck no one else would touch. 6 women, $32, one condemned building. They were about to rewrite the rules of a company town in the middle of a winter that could kill them all. Hollister Gulch sat in a narrow valley in the Montana Territory, a town that existed only because the company had dug a hole in the ground and found silver. 300 men worked the mine in 12-hour shifts, breathing dust that would kill half of them before they turned 40. Their families lived in identical tar paper shacks along the creek, paying rent deducted directly from wages. The company owned every building, sold every sack of flour, and even charged men for the candles they wore on their caps underground. When a miner complained, he was fired and evicted before the next shift whistle. On the morning of October 3, 1884, a spark touched off a pocket of methane in shaft number 7. The blast shook the boarding house 300 yards away. 41 men never came up. One of them was Tom O'Connell. Maria heard the explosion from the garden. She was 7 months pregnant with their 4th child. By noon, the widows had gathered at the pit head, wrapped in shawls against the autumn wind, watching the company men haul up bodies on the ore tram. No one offered them a blanket. No one offered them a word. 2 days later, the funerals were held in a cold drizzle. On the third day, Mr. Cyrus Hollister, nephew of the company's founder and superintendent of the mine, posted the notices. Each widow received a typed slip of paper. Due to the cessation of employment, housing allowance is terminated. Occupancy must end within 14 days. The language was crisp, official, and utterly merciless. By the end of the week, 3 families had already packed their wagons and gone. The roads out of the gulch led only to harder country. Some would try to reach relatives in Butte or Bozeman. Others would simply disappear. But Maria O'Connell did not cry. She had spent 10 years watching the company pull silver from the earth while it sucked the life from the men who dug it. She had seen the store charge $1 for a sack of cornmeal that cost 15 cents in the valley. She had watched her husband bring home $40 a month in scrip while his actual wages ran 4 times that. And she knew things the other widows did not. Maria could read. She could figure. And she could see the infrastructure of a town that had been designed to bleed families dry. The foreman's boarding house stood on a low rise just above the creek, a 2-story frame building with a sagging porch and a roof that leaked in 3 places. The company had condemned it after the previous foreman, a man named Loomis, died of a heart attack in the kitchen. No one wanted it. The place smelled of old whiskey and damp wool, and the floorboards creaked like a man groaning in his sleep. But Maria had been inside that house many times. She knew it had 6 bedrooms, a massive iron stove in the kitchen, and a root cellar that stayed cool even in July. More important, she knew it sat on a parcel of land Loomis had purchased outright from the company back in 1878, the only private title in the entire gulch. 3 days after the notices went up, Maria walked into the company office. Mr. Hollister sat behind a walnut desk, a man of 40 with oiled hair and eyes that never seemed to blink. She told him she wanted to buy the old Loomis place. Hollister laughed out loud. "That building isn't fit for hogs," he said. "How much?" she asked. He named a price, $50, thinking she would wilt. Maria counted $32.40 onto his desk, every cent from the 5 other widows she had already gathered. Hollister stared at the pile of coins and crumpled bills as if a stray dog had just walked in and laid a bird at his feet. He took the money. He wrote the deed. And he smiled as she left, because as far as he was concerned, he had just sold a rotting coffin to a desperate woman with a winter coming that would shatter anyone who tried to survive it alone. Maria did not go back to her shack. Instead, she walked to the boarding house, pried the condemned notice off the door, and began sweeping the floor. By nightfall, 5 other widows had joined her. There was Margaret Ness, tall and silent, whose husband had been the mine carpenter. She knew how to frame a wall and swing a hammer. There was Ellen Callahan, the oldest, with 4 children and a voice that could quiet a crying baby from across a room. Catherine Shaw, barely 20, 3 months married when the blast took her husband and every penny they had. Ruth Bellamy, the seamstress, whose eyes had gone hard in the days after the funeral. And Lizzie Tran, the washerwoman, who had been born in Canton and could make a soup from ingredients other women threw away. None of them had anywhere else to go. None of them had enough money to survive the winter alone. But together, they had $32 and a building the company had deemed worthless. The first night, they lit candles and walked through every room. The walls were stained, the windows cracked, and the wind blew straight through gaps wide enough to slide a hand through. The children huddled in a single bed while the women sat around the cold stove and talked until dawn. The plan was simple. The house was large enough for all of them, provided they could keep it warm. Maria had noticed something else about the foreman's place. Unlike the flimsy shacks along the creek, the boarding house had been built with thick timber framing and double-planked walls. It had a proper foundation sunk 3 feet into the ground. It was ugly, but it was strong. Over the next week, Margaret tore out the rotted porch boards and replaced them with salvaged lumber from an abandoned sluice box. Ellen and Catherine stuffed every crack with strips of old burlap and creek clay. Ruth sewed heavy wool curtains from an old blanket and hung them over the broken windows. Lizzie figured out how to make the stove draw properly by extending the flue pipe with a bent metal sheet. And Maria began watching the sky. She knew what winter could do in this country. She had seen a blizzard freeze cattle standing upright, their eyes turned to ice. But she also knew something the company did not. The boarding house sat in a strange, natural pocket of still air where the creek curved around the rise. The wind that howled down the gulch always seemed to break just short of the porch, deflected by the angle of the hill. The shacks along the creek, by contrast, were built directly in the wind tunnel. Word of the women's purchase spread through Hollister Gulch. The miners who remained, the ones who still had jobs, watched them from a distance as they worked. Some shook their heads. A woman living without a man was a recipe for disaster, they said. 6 of them living together was outright lunacy. Old Doc Harmon, the company physician, stopped his buggy on the road and peered at the half-repaired porch. He had been stitching up miners for 20 years and had seen every kind of stubbornness the frontier could produce. But this was something new. "Maria," he called out, "you know they're going to cut the coal." She paused, a hammer in one hand. "What do you mean?" "The company store," Harmon said. "They're cutting off credit. Any family without a man on the payroll won't be able to buy coal this winter. It's already in the ledger." Maria set the hammer down. She stared across the creek at the cluster of shacks where the other widows had been evicted from, the ones who had refused to join her. Those women were already trying to barter their belongings for firewood. They would not last through December. "That's murder," she said quietly. "It's business," Harmon replied. He snapped the reins and drove on. That evening, Maria gathered the women in the kitchen. The stove was finally working and a small fire crackled inside it. The children slept in the next room. She told them what Harmon had said. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ruth asked the question that had been hanging over all of them. "How much coal do we have?" There was none, not a single lump. Lizzie stared at the fire. "We can burn wood," she said. "The company owns the timber rights," Margaret replied. "If they catch us cutting on their land, they'll have us arrested." "So we freeze," Catherine whispered. Maria looked around the room at the faces of the other women, faces that had been stretched thin by grief and worn down by poverty. But there was something else there now, too. Anger. "No," she said. "We don't freeze, we adapt. We've already got a house they thought we couldn't fix. We've already got a roof they thought we'd lose. If the company wants to starve us out, they're going to have to learn something they should have figured a long time ago." She pulled a piece of paper from her apron, a list she had been writing in the dark hours of the night. On it were the prices the company store charged for every essential: flour, sugar, beans, salt, kerosene, and coal. Next to each number, she had written the actual prices she remembered from the days before the company ran its own store. The markups ran as high as 500%. "We don't just need to survive this winter," Maria said. "We need to make it so no family in this gulch ever has to beg the company for warmth again. And I know exactly where to start." She looked toward the shuttered window, toward the road that led to the company store, and the other women understood. The first snow began to fall softly over Hollister Gulch, dusting the frozen creek and settling on the roof of the condemned boarding house that now held 6 widows, 8 children, and a secret that was about to undo a company town from the inside out. The first snow did not stop falling for 3 days. It softened the edges of the creek banks, buried the abandoned shacks, and turned the narrow wagon road into a white scar across the gulch. Inside the boarding house, the women watched their breath hang in the air each morning until Margaret got the stove going with the last scraps of broken fence rails they had scavenged from the collapsed horse corral behind the mine office. The fire burned hot for an hour, then died to embers. There was simply nothing left to feed it. Maria stood at the kitchen window on the 4th morning, looking down into the gulch where the company shacks huddled along the frozen creek. Smoke rose from only a handful of chimneys. The others were cold. The widows who had been evicted had mostly gone. Some fled to nowhere, some were taken in by relatives who had little to spare. But a few remained, squatting in their empty shacks with no men, no wages, and no coal. Maria could see a woman named Agnes Dempsey dragging a child-sized sled loaded with sticks along the creek bed. The sticks were green, thin. They would smolder and smoke, give almost no heat. Lizzie Tran appeared at Maria's elbow. "That's the 3rd time she's gone foraging this week," Lizzie said. "She'll strip the whole gulch by Christmas." Maria nodded slowly. "And then she'll freeze." She turned from the window. "We need a fuel source, not just for us. If the company cuts off coal to every family without a wage, half this town is finished. And the ones who aren't finished will be so desperate they'll take anything the company offers. They'll sign new contracts deeper than the old ones. That's what Hollister wants." But fuel was only one piece. To stay through the winter, they needed food, kerosene, candles, and medicine. The company store sold everything, at prices that consumed a man's entire pay. A widowed woman with no credit had no standing at all. Maria gathered the women around the kitchen table that evening while the children ate thin porridge made from the last of the cornmeal. She spread out her list of price comparisons on the worn tabletop. "Listen to this," she said. "The company charges $1 for a gallon of kerosene. The freight cost from Butte is 12 cents a gallon. They charge 60 cents for a pound of sugar. You can buy it in Helena for 8 cents. A sack of flour, 90 cents here, 14 cents there. They've been bleeding this town dry for years and nobody's had anywhere else to go." Margaret Ness leaned forward. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Maria replied, "that if we can get a wagon to the railhead at Silver Bow, we can buy supplies at real prices and bring them back. We can sell them to the families here at a fair markup, maybe 15%, and cut the company out completely." "But we have no wagon," Ruth said flatly. "No horses, no money." Maria looked around the table. They had pooled every cent to buy the house. There was nothing left, or almost nothing. "Lizzie," Maria said, "you wash laundry for one of the shift bosses, don't you?" Lizzie nodded. "Mr. Parnell, he pays me 20 cents a week." "And you, Ruth, you mend the miners' shirts." "I do," Ruth said. 2 cents a shirt, sometimes 3 if the tier is bad." "And Catherine, you can bake bread, can't you?" Catherine's face brightened. "My mother taught me. I can bake good bread even with poor flour." "Then we start there," Maria said. "We work, every one of us. We take the smallest coins and we save them. We don't spend a single cent at the company store. And when we have enough, we find a teamster who isn't afraid of Hollister and we buy our own supplies." The plan was fragile. It would take weeks, maybe months. But for the first time since the explosion, something other than grief flickered in the eyes of the 6 women. The winter deepened. By mid-November, the temperature in the gulch dropped so low that water thrown into the air fell as ice pellets. The boarding house, for all its cracks and leaks, held warmth better than any of the shacks. The double-planked walls Margaret had patched trapped heat between the layers. The thick wool curtains Ruth had sewn blocked the drafts that whistled through the window frames. And Lizzie's modification to the stove flue made every scrap of fuel burn almost twice as long. But they were still burning scrap wood, and scrap wood was running out. One afternoon, Benny Shaw, Catherine's 8-year-old brother who had come with her after the blast, came running into the yard dragging a piece of old timber. "Miss Maria," he panted, "I found a whole pile of wood behind the abandoned stamp mill." Margaret went to look. Behind the collapsed building at the north end of the gulch, a forgotten scrap heap of squared timbers and broken beams lay half buried in snow. It was mine timber, too splintered for use underground, too heavy to cart off. The company had left it to rot years ago. They hauled the wood back to the boarding house in armfuls, then in a salvaged pushcart. Margaret split the timbers with a broad axe while Catherine and Ruth stacked the pieces in the root cellar where they would stay dry. For a week, the stove never went cold, but the scrap heap was finite, and the company noticed. On the last day of November, a company man named Decker rode up to the house with 2 deputies from the county seat. Decker was the mine bookkeeper, a thin man with a habit of smiling when he delivered bad news. "Ladies," he called from the yard, "you're trespassing on company property. That timber belongs to the Hollister Gulch Mining Company." Margaret stepped onto the porch with the axe still in her hand. "That's trash," she said. "It's been rotting behind a dead mill for years. We're just clearing it." "Trash or not," Decker said, "it's on company land. You'll return what you've taken or we'll file charges." The deputies said nothing. They looked cold and uncomfortable and slightly embarrassed, but they would do what the company told them. Maria appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a cloth. "How much?" she asked. Decker blinked. "What? How much does the company want for the scrap timber?" He had not expected that. He fumbled for a moment, glanced at the deputies, then named a figure, $10. It was absurd. The wood was worth maybe $3 even in winter, but Maria simply nodded. "We'll pay $2 now," she said, "and the rest by Christmas." She took the money from a small tin box beside the stove while Decker stood in the yard, frowning at the neat stacks of split wood, the patched porch, the chimney that was still smoking steadily despite the cold. He had come expecting to intimidate 6 desperate widows. Instead, he was standing in front of a functioning household that had just bargained him down to a fifth of his price. He took the $2 silver, wrote a receipt on a scrap of paper, and left without another word. That night Maria added up the numbers again. They had paid for the scrap wood. They were earning coins from laundry and mending and the occasional loaf of bread sold to a miner with a sweet tooth. But the money was barely moving. At this rate, they would not have enough for a supply run until spring. Then the first fever came. It started with Lizzie's youngest, a 3-year-old boy named Samuel. He woke in the night with a cough that shook his whole frame. By morning, his eyes were glassy and his skin burned hot. Catherine's infant daughter caught it next, followed by Ellen Callahan's 2 middle children. Within 4 days, nearly half the children in the house were sick. Doc Harmon came without being asked, arriving in his buggy with snow caked on the wheels. He listened to the small chests with a wooden stethoscope, pressed his fingers to the little foreheads, and finally straightened with a grim expression. "Lung fever," he said. "It's moving through the shacks already. 4 children died in the lower gulch last week." Maria felt the words like a blow. "What do they need?" "Quinine, a grain powder, must be weighed carefully, and warmth, constant warmth, no drafts." He looked around the room at the patched walls, the heavy curtains, the stove radiating steady heat. "Honestly, Mrs. O'Connell, these children have a better chance here than anywhere in Hollister Gulch. But the medicine, the company store has it. $8 a dose." $8 was more than Margaret made in a month of carpentry, more than the entire household had saved in the tin box, and there were 5 sick children. Maria did not hesitate. She walked to the company store that afternoon, pushing through the blowing snow. Mr. Ketchum, the store manager, was a round man with thin hair and thick suspenders. He had been charging miners double prices for so long he no longer understood what a fair sum was. $8 a dose," he repeated, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. "Cash only, no credit." Maria had exactly $6.15 in her apron pocket, plus the two she had paid Decker that she no longer had. "I need 5 doses," she said. Ketchum shrugged. $40. She stared at him through the counter glass, past the jars of peppermint and the bolts of calico, and saw the ledger book open behind him. She saw the credit column, the names of the dead miners who had owed the store, the notes that said deceased balance forfeited. The company had taken their wages, their homes, their food money, and now it would take their children's lives for the price of a powder that cost 30 cents to manufacture. "Is there no credit for a dying child?" Maria asked quietly. Ketchum did not look up from his ledger. "The company cannot extend credit without a wage earner on the account. Those are the rules." Maria stood there for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back into the snow. By the time she reached the boarding house, the children's coughing had grown worse. Samuel was thrashing in his sleep. Lizzie held him against her chest, her face still, but Maria could see the terror beneath it. "I couldn't get the medicine," Maria said, "but I'm going to get it anyway." That night she wrote a letter. It was addressed to a wholesale druggist in Butte, a man she had heard about from Doc Harmon, a supplier who sold directly to doctors and never touched company stores. She explained the situation in 3 lines: children dying, company price gouging, 6 widows with no access to fair medicine. She asked for credit, just enough for 1 shipment of quinine. She had no idea if the letter would reach its destination. The mail went out on a freight wagon that ran only when the roads were clear. But 2 weeks later, during the darkest stretch of December, a package arrived at the boarding house. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Inside were 10 doses of quinine powder, a bottle of camphorated oil, and a note that read, "Use these well, payment when fortune allows, a friend." Lizzie wept. Catherine pressed the package to her chest, and Maria distributed the medicine with steady hands while the wind howled outside. One by one, the children's fevers broke. Samuel was the last. On the morning his eyes finally cleared and he asked for water in a small, cracked voice, the whole house exhaled. But there was no time to rest, because the company had figured out what the women were doing. Not the medicine that had slipped past them, but the quiet defiance that was spreading through the gulch. Miners' wives were coming to the boarding house now. They came with small purchases: a loaf of Catherine's bread, a mended shirt from Ruth, a pot of Lizzie's soup, and they paid in coins. Coins that stayed in the gulch instead of flowing into the company till. Some of the women began asking questions. Where had they found the scrap wood? How was their stove burning so steadily? How were 6 widows feeding 8 children when other families could barely feed 3? Maria answered carefully. She showed them the root cellar, now stocked with split timber and jars of preserved beans. She explained how they bought nothing from the company store, how every cent they earned went toward a common fund. And slowly, a new idea began to circulate through the lower shacks, that it might be possible to live outside the company's grip. Ketchum noticed the change. Sales of flour and kerosene dropped sharply in December. Miners who had always bought on credit were coming into the store with fewer purchases, carrying fewer debts, and the store's profit margins had been built on those debts for 20 years. On the morning of December 18th, Cyrus Hollister himself rode up to the boarding house. He did not dismount. He sat on a tall bay gelding, wrapped in a buffalo coat, and looked at the house with a contempt that bordered on fascination. The sagging porch was now level and solid. The broken windows were glazed with new glass, salvaged from the abandoned assay office. The chimney smoked steadily, and the path to the door was shoveled clean. "Mrs. O'Connell," he called. Maria stepped outside, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. "I've been hearing things," Hollister said. "Strange things. They say you're running a store out of this place." "I'm not running a store," Maria replied. "I'm feeding children." Hollister's horse pawed at the frozen ground. "You're selling goods without a license, you're cutting into company revenue, and you're encouraging insubordination among the miners' families." "I'm not selling anything," Maria said evenly. "I'm sharing. The law doesn't license sharing." Hollister's jaw tightened. "Let me be plain. If you continue this, I will have the sheriff evict you from that house. I don't care what deed you hold. We have judges who understand the company's interests." "And if the miners stop working because their families are freezing," Maria asked, "who protects the company's interests then?" It was a question Hollister had not considered. The mine needed men. If the men's families starved, the men would leave, or worse, they would organize. The silver lode in Shaft 7 was still rich. A labor shortage in winter would be catastrophic. He glared at her for a long moment. Then he wheeled his horse and rode away without another word. That night, snow began falling again. But inside the boarding house, the children slept soundly. The women sat around the kitchen table counting coins. They had saved $11.40, enough for a freight wagon, enough for a load of supplies, enough to begin. Margaret looked at the small pile of money. "So who's going?" she asked. Maria looked out the window at the white road. "I am," she said. "And if I come back with a wagon full of goods at fair prices, this gulch will never belong to the Hollister family again." The words hung in the warm air of the kitchen, as heavy as a promise, because Maria O'Connell was about to do more than survive a winter. She was about to build an economy the company could not control, and in doing so, she would force a reckoning that would shake Hollister Gulch to its frozen foundations. Maria left 2 days later, on a morning so cold the snow squealed under her boots. She rode with a teamster named Orville Peck, a hard-drinking man with a wagon and 4 mules who had never liked the company and was willing to haul freight for a widow's silver. They traveled east through the frozen canyon, the wagon bed empty except for a shovel, a canvas tarp, and a small iron box holding $11.40. The road to Silver Bow was 46 miles, most of it rutted and drifted. A storm could close it in an hour. A broken axle could mean death. But staying in Hollister Gulch without supplies meant death anyway, just slower. The journey took 3 days. Maria slept under the wagon beside the mules, wrapped in her shawl and a borrowed buffalo robe. On the second night, the temperature dropped to 20 below. Her water froze solid inside the canteen. She chewed snow and thought of the children in the boarding house, their chests still rattling from the fever, the stove eating the last of the scrap timber. She thought about Hollister sitting in his warm office, about Ketchum's ledger full of dead men's debts, and she did not sleep again until dawn. Silver Bow was little more than a rail depot and 2 streets of false front shops, but it had a wholesale dry goods house, a feed supplier, and a druggist who would sell quinine at cost to anyone who mentioned Doc Harmon's name. Maria traded for everything on her list: a barrel of flour, 50 pounds of sugar, 20 pounds of salt, a crate of dried beans, tins of baking powder, a bolt of calico, 3 gallons of kerosene, a stock of patent medicines, and a sack of hard candies for the children. She bought no coal, that would have to come later, but she purchased a hundredweight of dried buffalo chips from a slaughterhouse pen, which would burn long and hot in the boarding house stove. The total came to $9.70. She paid in silver, loaded the wagon under Orville's direction, and turned the mules back toward the gulch before the sun had warmed the street. The return trip should have taken 2 days. It took 5. On the third afternoon, as the wagon crawled up the canyon grade, the trace chain snapped on the lead mule. Orville spent 4 hours lying under the wagon in the snow, mending the chain with a cold iron punch and fingers that turned white with frostbite. While he worked, Maria tramped ahead to find the drifted crossing at Rock Creek. The bridge had collapsed, probably in the fall, and no one had repaired it. The water beneath was frozen a foot thick, but the ice crust was soft in the center where the current ran fast. The mules could cross, but the loaded wagon might break through. She spent the rest of the daylight laying a path of brush and loose stones across the ice, her hands bleeding through the wool mittens. When the wagon finally lurched across, the rear wheel punched through the crust and spun for a terrifying 3 seconds before catching stone. Orville's face was gray. The load held. The last night, 6 miles from the gulch, they were stopped by a man with a shotgun. He stepped into the road from behind a stand of snow-buried pine, a figure in a heavy coat with the collar pulled high. "Turn around," he said. "This road is closed to freight that ain't company goods." Maria recognized the voice before she saw the face. It was Decker, the bookkeeper, though he was wearing a rough coat instead of his ledger room wool. He was shaking, not from cold but from fear of what he was doing. The shotgun wobbled in his hands. "Mr. Decker," Maria said quietly, "you are not a gunman, you're an accountant. Put that down before you hurt yourself or someone else." They'll fire me if I let you through, he said, his voice cracking. The company needs those supplies kept out. No competing victuals in the gulch. It's what Mr. Hollister said. Orville reached under the wagon seat, but Maria put her hand on his arm. She climbed down slowly, the snow reaching her knees, and walked toward Decker. He did not raise the shotgun. She stopped 3 feet away and looked him in the eyes. Mr. Decker, I have 8 children in my house. 3 of them barely shook off lung fever. There are 17 other children in the shacks below us, and nearly all of them are hungry. If you send this wagon back, you will be the man who starved them, not the company, not Mr. Hollister, you, and you will know it every night for the rest of your life. Decker's hands dropped. The muzzle sunk into the snow. He shook his head slowly, not looking at her, and then he stepped aside. He walked back into the trees without speaking, leaving the road open. The wagon rolled into Hollister Gulch at midnight under a high, cold moon. Word spread before sunrise. By the time the first gray light touched the creek, miners' wives were already trudging up the path to the boarding house, carrying empty flour sacks and handfuls of coin. Maria sold flour at 18 cents a pound. The company store charged 60. Sugar went for 15 cents a pound instead of 55. Kerosene, 40 cents a gallon instead of $1. She kept the margins thin, just enough to finance the next trip, just enough to buy more fuel and medicine, and she wrote every sale in a small cloth-bound notebook. No credit, no scrip, cash only. Within 10 days, Ketchum's till was nearly silent. The company store had been the only source of dry goods in the Gulch for 15 years. Miners had grumbled about the prices in private, but they had never had an alternative. Now, suddenly, an alternative existed, run by 6 women in a condemned boarding house with a root cellar full of supplies and a stove that never went cold. The effect was not just economic, it was psychological. Men who had felt trapped began to ask questions. Why did the company own the land under their shacks? Why were wages paid in scrip that could only be spent at the company store? Why had no one ever told them what flour cost in Silver Bow? Hollister sent Ketchum to the boarding house first. The store manager arrived with a leather ledger under his arm and an ultimatum prepared. "You will cease selling goods immediately," he announced from the porch, "or the company will bring suit for unlawful commerce." Maria did not stop bagging beans. "The company has no standing to regulate what I do on private deeded land. This property is not company-owned. You know that as well as I do." Ketchum blustered, then threatened, then left. The next visitor was a deputy marshal from the county seat, who read the deed, examined the house, and told Hollister there was nothing illegal about a widow selling flour from her kitchen. The law of Montana Territory, such as it was, did not forbid a household from trading with its neighbors, but Hollister had other tools. The coal was the first weapon. On the morning of January 10th, families who tried to purchase coal at the company yard were told the price had doubled, and deliveries would be cut to half weight. The miners were furious, but their contracts allowed it. Scarcity, the company argued, justified higher rates. The temperature in the Gulch was 27 below zero. Fires that had burned all night now guttered to embers before dawn. Within 3 days, a man named Jensen, a powder man from Shaft 4, collapsed at his workstation with frozen fingers. His wife had been burning green wood she scavenged from the creek because they could not afford the company's coal. The mine doctor amputated 2 of Jensen's fingers that night. Maria heard the news from Doc Harmon, who had become a quiet ally, slipping medical supplies to the boarding house and reporting on the company's movements. He sat in the warm kitchen with a cup of Lizzie's tea, his old hands wrapped around the mug. "They're trying to break the town," Harmon said. "Hollister figures if the families are desperate enough, they'll turn on you, beg the company to reopen the store at the old prices. That's how he means to kill your business, by freezing your customers." "But he is freezing his own men," Ellen said. "Hollister doesn't care about the men," Harmon replied. "He cares about control. As long as the mine runs, he can replace a few frozen fingers, but if he loses the store monopoly, he loses the whole system. The store is where the real profit lies. The silver just pays for the shovels." Maria sat in silence, her mind working. Then she said something that changed everything. "What if we sell coal?" Harmon set down his cup. "You don't have a coal mine, Maria." "No," she said, "but I know a man who does. A man who ships from Butte and has been undercut by the company for 10 years. His name is Hennessy. He owns a pit on the North Fork that produces twice the coal the company sells, and he'd sell at half their price if he had a route into the gulch." "The company owns the road," Margaret pointed out. "They'd never let his wagons through." Maria looked toward the window, toward the frozen creek and the white hills beyond. "The company owns the road on the south side of the creek. But the north bank is public land. It's rough and it's steep in places, but a sled can cross it. A narrow path. A winter road." The idea caught fire. Over the next 2 weeks, the 6 widows and a handful of miners who had quietly aligned with them worked in the dark hours before dawn and after dusk. They cut brush. They hauled stones to stabilize a crossing over the frozen creek. They carved a single slow path up through the wooded slope north of the gulch, leading to the open plateau where Hennessy's wagons could travel without touching company land. It was a mule track, barely wide enough for a sled, but it was theirs. On the 22nd of January, Hennessy's first sled arrived. It carried a ton of coal. Maria paid him $12 for the load cash from the profits of the dry goods sales and sold the fuel at 9 cents a hod, a quarter of what the company now charged. The coal yard that morning was empty. The boarding house yard was full. Hollister, watching from the mine office window, reportedly threw his inkwell against the wall. That was when the real campaign began. 2 nights later, someone tried to set fire to the root cellar. The arsonist used kerosene, doused the wooden door, and struck a lucifer. But Ellen Callahan was awake, rocking a restless baby, and she smelled the smoke before the flames caught. Margaret doused the fire with a bucket of snow water while Ruth and Catherine shoveled the blackened wood away from the stored supplies. The door was ruined, but the food was saved. Lizzie found a boot print in the snow, a large man's print, toe turned outward, with a distinctive chip out of the left heel. Doc Harmon confirmed the next morning that the same print matched a pair of boots worn by one of Hollister's personal hired men. No one was arrested. The sheriff's deputy, a man named Bonner who had been elected on company votes, declined to pursue the matter. "No proof of intent," he said, "but the town saw, the town knew, and something shifted in the gulch." For the first time in years, miners began to talk openly about organizing. Not about leaving, most had no money to leave, but about demanding changes, about withholding their scrip, about refusing to let the company control both the mine and the store that fed their families. Maria did not lead that conversation. The men led it themselves, but everyone knew where the spark had come from. By the end of January, the company store was selling barely enough to keep its doors open. Ketchum had laid off his 2 clerks. The shelves were half empty because Hollister refused to restock goods no one was buying. Even the miners who had not yet joined the boycott were spending only what they absolutely had to, saving their coins for the boarding house. The store was dying. And then Hollister made his fatal mistake. On the morning of February 3rd, a company notice was posted on the mine gate. It read, "Effective immediately, all miners' housing rents will be doubled to offset lost store revenues. Any man who refuses the increase will be subject to eviction." The miners read it in silence. Then they walked off the job. Not a strike, not formally, not organized, but a refusal. The morning shift simply did not go underground. The afternoon shift joined them. The mine pumps went silent, the hoist engine stopped, and 300 men stood in the snow waiting. Hollister locked himself in the office. He sent a telegram to the territorial governor asking for troops. The governor declined. He sent riders to hire strikebreakers from Butte, but the word had spread and no one came. The mine had been bleeding men for years, and now, starved of its supply lines and its labor, it was hemorrhaging. 3 days into the standoff, the company store was raided, not by violent men but by desperate women. A group of miners' wives, cold and hungry, walked into the store and simply took what they needed. Ketchum could not stop them. The deputy refused to intervene, and the last illusion of company control collapsed. That evening, Cyrus Hollister walked up to the boarding house alone. He did not ride his tall bay this time. He came on foot, through the snow, his buffalo coat flapping in the wind. He looked smaller than before, diminished. Maria met him on the porch. "I am closing the store," he said. "It's losing money faster than the mine can offset. The bank in Helena will foreclose on the building by March." Maria said nothing. He swallowed. "I came to suggest something. You've been selling goods anyway. You and your women, you could take over the store location. Legally. Buy the lease, buy the stock. I'd sell it cheap. A few $100s. You'd have the whole gulch in your pocket." Maria studied his face. The offer was not generosity. It was a trap. He expected her to fail, to take on debt and collapse under the weight of running a store with no capital, no credit, and no protection. He wanted to watch her drown in the very system that had killed her husband. But Maria O'Connell was no longer a widow begging for scraps. She was a woman with 5 partners, a house full of supplies, a network of allies across the gulch, and a ledger book that proved she could run a business at fair prices and still survive. "I'll consider it," she said. Hollister nodded stiffly and walked away into the dark. Inside the boarding house, Maria gathered the women around the table. She told them what Hollister had offered. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then Margaret spoke, her voice hard and certain. "We can't just buy the store," she said. "We have to change what it means to own a store in this gulch. No more scrip, no more credit traps, no more price gouging. We set the prices at cost plus a fair margin, and everyone knows the numbers." "We'd need money," Ruth said. "More than we have." Lizzie Tran stood up and walked to the stove. She pulled out a small cloth sack from behind the salt tin, a secret she'd been keeping since December. Inside were $37 in silver and copper coins, tips from miners who had paid a little extra for her laundry, for Catherine's bread, for the medicine that saved their children. "They've been slipping me coins for weeks," Lizzie said quietly. "Because they knew something like this was coming." The sack sat on the table and the pile of coins grew as each woman added what she had saved. Margaret's carpentry money, Ellen's sewing money, Catherine's bread money, Ruth's mending money, Maria's profits from the supplies. Together they counted $112, enough to buy the company store, enough to own the building that had once owned them. Outside, the wind howled across the gulch, but inside the boarding house, a new kind of silence settled over the room. It was the silence of a decision made, of a path chosen, of a coming reckoning that would change Hollister Gulch forever. Because the 6 widows were no longer just surviving the winter. They were about to seize the very institution that had crushed their families, and they would do it in plain sight of the man who believed they would fail. The purchase was completed on the morning of February 9th, 1885. Maria walked into the company office with $112 in a canvas sack, Margaret Ness flanking her left shoulder and Lizzie Tran on her right. Hollister had drawn up the papers himself, a dense 2-page contract that surrendered the store building, the attached warehouse, and the remaining stock of goods for the agreed sum. He pushed the document across the desk with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You'll find running a store requires more than baking bread and mending trousers," he said. Maria read every word aloud, pausing twice to correct a line that would have saddled them with a hidden debt for the building's previous coal deliveries. When she finished, she laid the silver on the desk. $112. Hollister stared at the coins for a long moment, coins that had come from washing shirts, from crusts of bread sold for pennies, from miners who had slipped extra nickels into a widow's hand. Then he signed. The 6 women stood in the empty store that same afternoon. The shelves were bare, the floor was thick with coal dust, and the big front window had a crack running diagonally from the corner to the lock. But the roof was sound, the stove was large enough to warm the whole space, and the back warehouse still held 3 tons of unsold coal that Hollister, in his haste, had forgotten to remove. Margaret lit the stove while Ellen swept the floors with a broom made of bound willow switches. Ruth sewed new curtains from the bolt of calico Maria had brought from Silver Bow. Catherine baked 3 loaves of bread in the store's small oven and set them on the counter with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Bread fresh this morning, 8 cents a loaf." It was 12 cents less than the company had charged for bread made from the same flour. By noon, the word had spread. Miners' wives who had been trudging up to the boarding house came instead to the old company store, now renamed in a hand-painted sign that hung above the door, "The Widow's Supply." The sign had been painted by Benny Shaw, Catherine's 8-year-old brother, who used a flat board and a brush made from horsehair. It was crooked and slightly too small, but it was theirs. The store opened its doors on February 10th at 7 in the morning, and by 7:15 the line stretched past the assay office. Maria stood behind the counter with her cloth-bound notebook open. But instead of hiding the costs, she did something no one in Hollister Gulch had ever seen before. She took a piece of paper and wrote down the true price of every item, what she had paid in silver bow, what the freight had cost, what the store added to cover its own fuel and labor. She tacked it to the wall beside the flour barrel. A miner named Curly McCann read the list 3 times, then laughed out loud. 9 cents profit on a sack of beans, he said. Ketchum was charging me 40. He bought 2 sacks before the day was out, and he told every man in his shift. Ketchum himself came to the store on the 3rd afternoon. He stood in the doorway watching the women work, Lizzie pouring dried beans into a bin, Ruth measuring out sugar, Catherine handing a small bag of hard candy to a child. His store, his ledgers, his empire of markup and credit was now a public market where prices were posted for anyone to read. He turned away without speaking. By the end of the week, he had packed his belongings and left the Gulch on a freight wagon. No one waved goodbye. Hollister's counterstrike arrived on February 20th. A notice appeared on the mine gate announcing that, effective March 1st, all company housing would be converted to cash-only rental at 4 times the previous rate. Men who could not pay would be evicted. It was a direct attack on the families who had abandoned the company store, and it was designed to remind every miner that Hollister still owned the ground beneath their cabins. That evening, a meeting was called in the long room of the boarding house. 63 men crowded into the space, standing shoulder to shoulder, while the women sat at the table with their ledgers open. Maria laid out the numbers. The widow's supply had already turned a profit of $43 in 10 days of operation. The store was buying coal from Hennessy's pit at $7 a ton and selling it to families at $11, still less than half what the company charged. The North Bank sled road was working, and a second team of mules had been hired to increase the freight runs. The boarding house itself was now a proven shelter that could survive the harshest winters without company fuel, and the 6 women who had started with $32 and a condemned building now held a functioning business, a stocked warehouse, and a growing reputation across the territory. "You don't need company housing," Margaret said bluntly. "You need land you own. And we can help you get it." That sentence changed the entire conversation. The women had already researched the homestead laws. Any citizen, or a widow of a citizen, could claim 160 acres of public land in the Montana Territory, provided they improved it and lived on it for 5 years. 6 women together could claim nearly 1,000 acres. If they pooled their claims and laid out a town site on land that did not belong to Hollister, the miners could move their families off company land entirely. In March, as the snow began to melt, the first new cabin rose on the bench land above the North Bank. It was built by Curly McCann and 2 other miners, using timber cut from a stand of lodgepole pine that had been too far from the road for the company to harvest. By April, 12 families had relocated. The shacks along the creek emptied, one by one, and the company's rental income collapsed. Hollister, now watching his entire labor force slip away, tried to sell the mine. But the silver lode in Shaft 7 had been exaggerated from the start. The company had been running on credit from a bank in Helena, using the store profits to keep the mine afloat while it searched for better veins. With the store gone and the miners decamped, the bank foreclosed. On the morning of May 2nd, Cyrus Hollister locked his office, climbed into a hired buggy, and left Hollister Gulch for the last time. He did not look back. No one asked him to. The final surprise came 3 weeks later when a territorial surveyor arrived to map the bench land for homestead filings. He carried a letter from the land office in Bozeman, and he called Maria aside to ask about the deed to the boarding house. That was when Maria discovered something that not even Hollister had known. The original foreman, Loomis, had not only bought the house parcel from the company, he had also filed a claim on a 40-acre strip along the north bank of the creek, a natural bench that the company had long considered part of its holdings, but had never legally recorded. The deed had been misfiled in the county courthouse for years. The land, by law, belonged to whoever held the Loomis title. Maria held the Loomis title. That 40 acres became the commons of a new town. The women donated half of it for a schoolhouse, a public well, and a meeting hall. The other half they divided into 20 small lots, sold for $1 each to any family that would build a cabin and plant a garden before the next winter. By midsummer, the settlement on the North Bench had a name: O'Connell Flats. It had no company store, no scrip, and no rent. It had a bakery, a laundry, a seamstress shop, and a dry goods cooperative run by 6 widows who still lived together in the old boarding house, now surrounded by a grove of young aspens that Ellen had planted to break the wind. In the fall of 1885, a traveling correspondent from the Butte Miner newspaper visited the flats and wrote a story headlined, "The Widows Who Beat a Company Town." It told of the explosion, the evictions, the $32 house, the winter that nearly starved them, and the store that broke a monopoly. The story ended with a description of Maria O'Connell, now 33 years old, standing on the porch of the boarding house with her newborn daughter in her arms. The child had been born in July, delivered by Doc Harmon in the very room where the women had counted their first coins by candlelight. Her name was Hope. The article did one other thing. It mentioned, in passing, the ledger Maria had kept, the cloth-bound notebook with every transaction, every price, every margin. A copy of that ledger reached a state legislator in Helena, who used it during hearings on Companytown reform. The following year, Montana Territory passed a law prohibiting employers from requiring workers to purchase goods exclusively from company-owned stores. It was called the O'Connell Provision. Back in the flats, none of the women talked much about history. They were too busy living. The store was open 6 days a week now, staffed in shifts so that everyone could still tend their gardens and care for the children. Margaret had built a workshop behind the boarding house and was training 2 boys in carpentry. Ellen had started a small infirmary in a spare room, stocked with supplies from the Butte druggist. Ruth and Catherine ran the bakery together, their bread known as far as Silver Bow. Lizzie had become the store's bookkeeper, her small, neat handwriting filling ledger after ledger, every number adding up to a profit the company had never been able to achieve because it had never understood the people it served. The mine in the old gulch eventually reopened under new ownership, a small cooperative organized by the miners themselves, who had scraped together enough savings to lease the workings from the bank. They sold their silver directly to a smelter in Helena, bypassing the middlemen who had once taken half the profit. By 1890, Hollister Gulch was a ghost of its former self, but O'Connell Flats was growing. The population reached 200 souls, and the schoolhouse had to be expanded twice. Maria O'Connell never married again. She lived in the boarding house with her partners for the rest of her life, raising 4 children and serving as the de facto mayor of a town that existed because 6 women had refused to be disappeared. On the wall of the store, beside the price list, she hung the original notice from the company, the one that said occupancy must end within 14 days. She kept it behind a pane of salvaged glass, a reminder to anyone who walked through the door that the rules that crush people are not always as solid as they pretend to be. And it was a reminder, too, of a deeper truth that frontier women like Maria understood in their bones. The same institutions that bleed families dry are not invincible. They are built on ledgers and assumptions and the quiet compliance of the people they exploit. But when a group of ordinary people decides to challenge that system, not with riots or revolutions, but with a better price, a warm room, and a loaf of bread baked just after sunrise, the whole machinery can crumble. 6 women with $32 did not just survive a company town. They stripped it for parts and built a better one from the rubble, proving that sometimes the most powerful force on the frontier is not silver, not law, and not violence. It is a group of widows who have decided they will never be victims again. The story of the O'Connell widows never made it into most history books. It was a small story, after all, 6 women in a forgotten Montana gulch, a winter that nearly buried them, a store that barely filled a single shelf when it first opened. But small stories have a way of doing what big ones cannot. They reveal how systems really work, not from the top down but from the ground up, where people live inside those systems and feel every splinter. The company town model was not unique to Hollister Gulch. It stretched across the West in the late 19th century, through coal camps in Colorado, copper towns in Arizona, timber settlements in Washington. The pattern was always the same. The company owned the land, the housing, the store, the doctor, the sheriff. It paid wages in scrip that could only be spent where the company dictated. It set prices that ensured no worker ever got ahead. And when a miner complained or died, the system simply replaced him and sent his family packing. That system was not an accident. It was a design. A machine built to extract maximum value from human labor while returning as little as possible. What Maria O'Connell and her 5 partners proved was that the machine had a flaw. Not a legal flaw. The laws of the Montana Territory were written to favor capital. Not a political flaw. The company owned the sheriff, the judge, even the mayor. The flaw was practical. The machine could not survive competition from people who understood its costs and refused to pay them. When the widow's supply posted its prices on the wall, it did more than offer cheaper flour. It exposed the lie that had held the company together, the idea that things had to be this way, that there was no alternative. Once people saw the true cost of a sack of beans, they could not unsee it. And once they started trading among themselves, the company's grip weakened in ways no strike or lawsuit could have achieved alone. This was not charity and it was not luck. It was a business. The 6 widows turned a profit in their first week not because they were saints, but because they offered a better deal. They understood that a store that bleeds its customers will eventually run out of blood. The company never understood that because the company never saw its workers as customers. It saw them as captive debtors. That blindness cost Cyrus Hollister his store, his mine, and eventually his legacy. The O'Connell provision, the Montana law that banned company store monopolies, was a direct result of the widow's story being told. But the larger lesson of O'Connell Flats is not about one law. It is about the power of refusing to accept a system as permanent. The women did not wait for permission. They did not form a political party or petition the governor. They simply looked at the world as it was, saw the cracks, and built something better inside them. That kind of quiet rebellion is fragile and easy to ignore, until suddenly it is not. Today, many of the places that once housed company towns are ghost towns, abandoned shacks, collapsed mines, rusting headframes. O'Connell Flats itself faded in the early 20th century as the silver played out and families moved on. The boarding house burned down in 1904. The store foundation is still visible if you know where to look, a low rectangle of stones half buried in sagebrush. The aspens Ellen planted still grow there, twisted and wind-bent, but alive. What remains is the question. If 6 widowed women with $32 could dismantle a company town in 1884, what systems do we live inside today that seem unchangeable? What prices are posted nowhere, hidden in the structures we take for granted? And what might happen if a small group of people simply decided to build something better, not by fighting the machine head-on, but by quietly outlasting it? Subscribe now to witness more forgotten stories of ordinary people who changed the world by refusing to accept the rules they were handed.